My name is Jolene Pace, and I'm 42 years old. 3 weeks ago, my father sat across from me in a booth at a diner outside Roanoke, Virginia, and asked me to save his manufacturing company. He slid a folder across the table, and his hands were shaking. Not from age, but from the particular kind of fear that comes when a man realizes the person he dismissed for over a decade is the only one who can pull him out of a hole he dug himself. I looked at the folder, then at his face, and I said, "You spent 12 years telling everyone I was the uneducated one. Why would you want someone like me anywhere near your business?" He didn't answer. He just pushed the folder closer. To understand why that moment mattered, you need to know what those 12 years looked like from where I was standing. My father, Gerald Pace, built Pace Industrial Coatings from a rented garage bay in 1989. By the time I was in high school, the company employed 60 people and supplied protective coatings to bridge contractors and municipal water systems across the mid-Atlantic. Dad was proud of that company the way some men are proud of a firstborn son. It was proof that he mattered, that he'd come from nothing and built something real. And honestly, he had. I respected him for it. I still do, in a complicated way that sits right next to a lot of pain. My older brother Corbin was the heir. That was never a secret. Corbin went to Virginia Tech, studied business, graduated with a 2.9 GPA that Dad treated like a Rhodes Scholarship. When Corbin came home and started working at the plant, Dad threw a cookout for the whole staff. There were banners. I remember standing near the cooler, holding a paper plate, watching Dad put his arm around Corbin and tell everyone that the future of Pace Industrial was secure. I was 20 at the time. I'd just finished my second year at a community college, paying my own way by working the front desk at a veterinary clinic. I hadn't told anyone in my family what I was studying, because every time I brought up school, Dad would wave his hand and say something like, "Jolene, college isn't for everyone and nothing wrong with honest work." He said it gently, the way you'd tell a child they probably shouldn't try out for the travel team. The kindness in his voice was what made it sting. He genuinely believed I wasn't capable, so I stopped telling him. I transferred to a 4-year university, James Madison, and commuted 40 minutes each way while working nights at a chemical supply distributor in Harrisonburg. I chose environmental science with a concentration in industrial compliance. I chose it because I understood coatings, solvents, curing agents, and waste streams better than most people twice my age. I'd grown up around them. The smell of epoxy resin is braided into my earliest memories. I wanted to understand the science behind what my father did, and I wanted to understand the regulations that governed it, because even as a teenager I'd noticed things at the plant that made me uneasy. Unlabeled drums near the creek, workers mixing compounds without respirators, a filing cabinet Dad called the graveyard, where inspection reports went to die. I graduated summa cum laude at 24. I didn't invite my family to the ceremony. I told myself it was because I didn't want to make a fuss. The truth was that I didn't want to watch Dad look surprised, or worse, unimpressed. By then, the story he told about me had solidified into family scripture. Jolene was the sweet one, the simple one, the one who worked with animals and didn't have the head for business. Corbin was the smart one. Corbin would carry the name. Let me tell you what Corbin actually carried. Within 5 years of joining the company, he'd fired the plant's only safety officer, replaced the bookkeeper with a friend from college who didn't know debits from credits, and convinced Dad to skip 2 rounds of environmental compliance audits because, in Corbin's words, those inspectors are just looking for a payday. Dad believed him. Dad believed everything Corbin said, because believing Corbin meant believing that his plan for the company's future was correct, and believing his plan was correct meant believing his life had gone the way it was supposed to. Meanwhile, I built a quiet career. I worked for a regional environmental consulting firm for 6 years, then moved to a position with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, where I spent 4 years conducting inspections of industrial facilities, including on 2 occasions facilities that used Pace Industrial Coatings. I never inspected Dad's plant directly, I made sure of that. But I knew enough about the industry to know that his operation was running on borrowed time. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every July 4th, I'd sit at Dad's table and listen to him talk about the business. He'd tell stories about new contracts, about how Corbin had landed a deal with a bridge contractor in West Virginia, about how the plant was running 3 shifts. And then, at some point, he'd turn to me and say something like, "Jolene's doing good too. She's got her little job with the state." Or he'd introduce me to a neighbor by saying, "This is my daughter. She went a different route. Not everybody needs a degree." He said it so often that even my mother, who knew I'd graduated, stopped correcting him. She told me once, quietly, while washing dishes, "He doesn't mean anything by it, Jolene. He just doesn't understand what you do." But here's the thing. I've learned about people who say someone doesn't mean anything by it. They always mean something by it. Dad needed me to be the lesser child because it validated the choice he'd made to pour everything into Corbin. If I was educated, if I was accomplished, and if I was capable, then he'd have to ask himself why he never invested in me, never encouraged me, never once asked what I was studying or what I dreamed about. It was easier to believe I was simple, so he did. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. Have you ever let someone believe a smaller version of you because correcting them felt like it would cost more than staying quiet? I let it go for 12 years. 12 years of being introduced as the daughter who went a different route. 12 years of watching Corbin get praised for decisions that were slowly poisoning the company. And in some cases, literally poisoning the ground beneath it. 12 years of biting my tongue at holiday dinners while Dad called Corbin a visionary and called me dependable, which in his vocabulary meant ordinary. Then came the phone call. It was a Tuesday in March. I was at my desk at home. I'd left the state job 2 years earlier to start my own environmental compliance consulting practice, which was doing well enough that I'd bought a small house outside Staunton and paid off my student loans. My phone rang and the number was Dad's, but the voice was Corbin's. "Jolene, we need to talk. Dad's in trouble." Corbin explained, in the clipped, defensive tone he always used when something was his fault, that the Virginia DEQ had issued a notice of violation against Pace Industrial for improper storage and disposal of hazardous waste. The violations were serious: contaminated soil near the property boundary, improperly manifested waste shipments, a storage area that hadn't been permitted. The DEQ was proposing a penalty of $340,000 and requiring a corrective action plan. If the company didn't respond adequately within 60 days, the case would be referred to the EPA, and the penalties could multiply. "Dad doesn't know what to do," Corbin said. "The lawyer we hired says we need an environmental consultant who understands both the technical side and the regulatory process, someone who can negotiate with the state and oversee the remediation. He gave us 3 names. You weren't on the list." "Then why are you calling me?" There was a pause, because the 3 people on the list all quoted between $200,000 and $400,000, and Dad can't afford that on top of the fine. And someone at the DEQ told Dad's lawyer that Jolene Pace used to work there and now does consulting. Dad didn't believe it at first. That sentence landed in my chest like a stone. Dad didn't believe it at first. After 42 years as his daughter, the idea that I might be qualified to help was literally unbelievable to him. "Corbin, I need to hear this from Dad." He's embarrassed. He should be. That's how I ended up at the diner 3 days later, sitting across from my father while he pushed a folder across the table and wouldn't meet my eyes. The folder contained the notice of violation, the proposed penalty, the lawyer's initial response, and a financial summary showing that Pace Industrial had about 14 months of operating capital left if the fine was paid in full, and remediation costs stayed under $150,000. If costs went higher, or the EPA got involved, the company would likely close. I read every page while Dad sat there. When I finished, I closed the folder and looked at him. His hair had gone white since the last time I'd seen him, at Christmas, and his face had the drawn look of a man who hadn't slept well in weeks. "Why didn't you maintain your permits?" I asked. Corbin said we didn't need to renew some of them. He said the regulations had changed. "They didn't change, Dad. They got stricter." He rubbed his forehead. "I trusted him." "You trusted him because you wanted to." He didn't argue. That was new. I told him I'd review the situation, but I set 3 conditions. First, I'd assess the violations independently, and if I found evidence that the contamination was worse than reported, I'd tell the DEQ, not hide it. Second, I'd be paid my standard consulting rate, not a family discount. Third, Corbin would not be involved in any environmental decisions going forward. Dad agreed to all 3, though the third one made his jaw tighten. When I got home that night, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet. I'd been divorced for 2 years. A marriage that had ended for reasons unrelated to my family, though my ex-husband once told me that I had a habit of accepting less than I deserved from people I loved, and he wasn't wrong. I sat there and thought about what it would mean to step into my father's company, to use the degree he'd pretended didn't exist, to fix the mess his favorite child had created. Part of me wanted to say no. That part was loud, and it had good reasons. But there was another part. The part that had spent 20 years learning everything I could about this exact kind of problem, partly because I loved the science and partly because, if I'm being honest, I'd always imagined a moment when my father would need what I knew. I'm not proud of that. Wanting a parent's approval at 42 is not something you put on a resume, but it was real, and pretending it wasn't would be a lie. I started the assessment the following Monday. What I found at the plant was worse than the notice of violation suggested. The contaminated soil extended further than the initial sampling showed. The storage area wasn't just unpermitted, it had been built over a drainage swale that fed into a tributary of the Roanoke River. And the waste manifests Corbin had been signing for the past 3 years contained errors that weren't accidental. He'd been listing waste as non-hazardous when the safety data sheets clearly classified it otherwise. That's not a paperwork mistake. That's falsification, and it carried separate penalties. I documented everything. I photographed the storage area, collected soil samples, reviewed 3 years of manifests, and compiled a technical report that was thorough enough to serve as both a corrective action plan and a disclosure. Then I called Dad and asked him to meet me at the plant on a Saturday morning when no one else would be there. We stood in the storage area. I showed him the drums, the drainage swale, the soil staining. I showed him the manifests with Corbin's signature. I explained what each violation meant, what the penalties could be, and what the DEQ would likely require. Dad was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Corbin told me all of this was handled." It wasn't. He said the waste hauler took care of the paperwork. The waste hauler fills out their portion based on what your facility tells them. Corbin signed the generator sections. He classified the waste. He's responsible. Dad leaned against a concrete block wall and closed his eyes. How bad is this? If we disclose voluntarily and present a strong corrective action plan, the DEQ may reduce the penalty and avoid referring the case to EPA. If we don't disclose, and they find out on their own, and they will because they'll do follow-up sampling, the penalties double, and Corbin could face personal liability. Personal liability? He signed false manifests, Dad, knowingly. That's a criminal provision under RCRA. I watched my father process this. I watched him try to find a version of events where Corbin was still the capable son, and I was still the simple daughter who didn't understand business. I could see him reaching for it, the way you reach for a handrail that isn't there. "What do you recommend?" he finally asked. "Full voluntary disclosure, comprehensive corrective action plan, negotiate the penalty down based on good faith cooperation, remove Corbin from any role involving environmental compliance, safety, or waste management, hire a qualified plant manager. And if Corbin won't step back, then I walk, and you hire one of those $300,000 consultants, and you pray the DEQ doesn't find the manifests before your lawyer can negotiate." Dad called Corbin that afternoon. I wasn't there for the conversation, but I heard about it from my mother, who called me that evening sounding exhausted. She said Corbin had shouted, accused Dad of betraying him, accused me of sabotaging the company to make myself look important, and stormed out. He told Dad that I was exaggerating the violations to justify my consulting fee. That accusation stung more than I expected, because it was exactly the kind of thing that had worked on Dad for decades, reframe any criticism of Corbin as jealousy or self-interest from someone less capable. But this time, Dad had seen the drums. He'd seen the drainage swale. He'd seen Corbin's signature on documents that said non-hazardous next to waste streams that were clearly labeled otherwise. 3 days later, Corbin called me directly. His voice was controlled, almost pleasant, which was more unsettling than shouting. "Jolene, I think we can work this out without involving the DEQ any further. I've been talking to a hauler who can move the drums this week, and I know a contractor who can dig out the stained soil. We clean it up quietly, respond to the notice of violation with a corrective action plan, and nobody needs to know about the manifests." Corbin, that's concealment. If the DEQ discovers undisclosed contamination during their follow-up, the company loses all credibility and the penalties become punitive. They won't find it if we move fast. I'm not going to help you hide contamination from a regulatory agency, and if you do this without my involvement, I'll have an ethical obligation to report it. The line went silent for several seconds. Then Corbin said very quietly, "You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Your whole life you've been waiting for a chance to prove you're better than me." I thought about that question for a long time after he hung up. Was he right? Had some part of me been waiting? Maybe, but wanting recognition doesn't mean manufacturing the crisis. I didn't put those drums there. I didn't falsify those manifests. I didn't spend 12 years dismantling the company's safety infrastructure while Dad applauded. Corbin did that. What I did was spend 20 years learning how to fix it. The next 2 months were grueling. I prepared the voluntary disclosure, negotiated with the DEQ case manager, a woman I'd worked with years ago, which helped establish trust but also meant I had to be scrupulously transparent, and developed a phased corrective action plan that included soil excavation, groundwater monitoring, and a compliance management system. The DEQ agreed to reduce the penalty to $185,000 in exchange for full cooperation and voluntary disclosure of the manifest issues. They declined to pursue criminal referral against Corbin, partly because the company self-reported and partly because the contamination, while serious, hadn't reached the river. But they required that Corbin be removed from any compliance role, and they placed the facility under a consent order with quarterly reporting for 3 years. Dad paid the reduced fine out of the company's reserves. The remediation costs came to $127,000, financed through a payment plan I helped negotiate. The company survived, but barely. 2 contracts were lost when clients learned about the violations. That information becomes public, and 3 longtime employees quit because they were angry about conditions they'd complained about for years without being heard. Corbin didn't speak to me for 6 weeks. Then at a family dinner my mother insisted on hosting, he showed up with his wife, Tanya, and sat across from me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed calm. Halfway through the meal, he said, "I want to acknowledge that I made mistakes at the plant, and I'm grateful Jolene stepped in." It sounded like something a therapist had written on an index card. Tanya was watching him with the particular alertness of a wife who'd coached the performance. I nodded and said thank you, because what else do you say to an apology that costs the speaker nothing? But Dad was the one I was watching, and what I saw in him during those months was something I hadn't expected. Not a dramatic transformation, not a tearful confession, something smaller and more painful, the slow, reluctant dismantling of a story he'd told himself for decades. He started asking me questions about the business, real questions, technical questions, questions that assumed I knew what I was talking about. He started visiting the plant on days when I was there overseeing the remediation, and he'd stand near me and watch, not supervising but learning. Once he picked up a copy of the corrective action plan I'd written and read it front to back, and when he finished he said, "You wrote this?" "Yes." He stopped. "This is excellent work, Jolene." I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt grief, because that sentence, "This is excellent work," was something I'd needed to hear when I was 14 and acing chemistry, when I was 18 and choosing a major, when I was 24 and walking across a stage to collect a diploma that no one in my family witnessed. Hearing it at 42 in a contaminated storage yard while cleaning up my brother's mess didn't feel like victory. It felt like arriving at a house where someone you loved used to live and finding it empty. The genuine setback I haven't told you about yet came in month 3 of the remediation. The groundwater monitoring wells showed elevated levels of a solvent compound that wasn't in any of the waste we documented. It meant there was a second source of contamination. Older, deeper, possibly from the years before Corbin took over. Possibly from Dad's own early operations, back when environmental regulations were looser and compliance was casual. I had to tell Dad that the contamination might be partly his responsibility, that the cost of addressing it could add another $80,000 to $120,000, that the DEQ would need to be notified, and that Corbin, for all his failures, might not be the only one who'd cut corners. Dad sat in his office chair and stared at the monitoring data I'd printed out. The office smelled like the same cheap coffee it had smelled like when I was a child, sitting on the floor drawing pictures while he made phone calls. He looked old in that moment. Not just aged, diminished. "I thought I was careful," he said. "You were careful by the standards of the time, but the standards changed, and some of this should have been addressed years ago." He nodded slowly. "So I've been blaming Corbin for something I started." "You've been blaming Corbin for the violations he committed, and those are real, but the underlying contamination is more complicated than one person." That conversation was the hardest moment of the entire process. Not because Dad was angry, he wasn't. Because for the first time, I saw him sit with the full weight of his own choices, without deflecting them onto someone else. And I realized that what I'd wanted from him all those years wasn't just praise, it was honesty. I wanted him to see things as they actually were, the company, the contamination, Corbin, and me. The additional remediation extended the timeline by 4 months and cost $94,000. Dad took out a small business loan to cover it. The DEQ amended the consent order to include the older contamination. The plant stayed open, but it was leaner, quieter, and more careful than it had been in decades. In the end, there was no courtroom scene, no dramatic public reckoning. Corbin kept his job at the company, but in a reduced role, sales and client relations, which he was actually good at when he wasn't pretending to understand things he didn't. Dad hired a plant manager with an engineering background and gave me a standing consulting contract for quarterly compliance reviews. He paid me fairly. He introduced me to the new plant manager as my daughter Jolene, who has a degree in environmental science from JMU and her own consulting firm. The way he said it was careful, like someone learning to pronounce a word in a language they'd resisted speaking. My mother called me the week after that introduction. She said, "Your father told Ed Crowder at church that you saved the company. He said you were the smartest person he knows." I was standing at my kitchen sink when she told me that. I looked out the window at the dogwood tree in my backyard, a tree I'd planted the spring after my divorce when I needed to put something alive into the ground. It was blooming. I held the phone against my ear and felt something I couldn't name for a long time. It wasn't happiness exactly. It wasn't anger. It was the feeling of a door opening in a wall you'd stopped believing had a door. I still have dinner with Dad every other Sunday. We talk about the plant, about the monitoring results, about the new contracts he's trying to land. Sometimes we talk about other things, the weather, the Hokies, a documentary he watched. We don't talk about the 12 years he called me uneducated. I've thought about bringing it up, about asking him to say explicitly that he was wrong, that he underestimated me, that he's sorry. But I've learned something about apologies. Sometimes the clearest one isn't a sentence. Sometimes it's a man reading a 60-page corrective action plan his daughter wrote, setting it down and saying, "This is excellent work, Jolene," with his voice breaking on the last syllable. Corbin and I are civil. We'll never be close. He still believes, somewhere beneath his rehearsed accountability, that I leveraged a crisis to elevate myself. Maybe he needs to believe that the way Dad needed to believe I was simple, because the alternative would mean sitting with something too heavy to hold. I don't have the energy to change his mind. I have the energy to do my work, maintain my boundaries, and show up for my father, while he's still here to show up for. The dogwood tree bloomed again this spring. I stood under it on a Sunday morning before driving to Dad's house, and I thought about the girl who used to sit on the floor of that office, drawing pictures while the smell of epoxy drifted through the walls. She didn't know what she'd become. She just knew she wanted to understand how things worked. Why coatings adhered, why solvents dissolved, why the creek behind the plant sometimes smelled like something that wasn't water. She figured it out. It just took a while for anyone to notice. I want to leave you with a question. If someone in your life has been telling a smaller story about who you are you waiting for them to rewrite it? Or have you already started writing your own?